So, if you've ever talked to a liberal about racial politics in the US, then you've heard this line that black people have a harder time getting jobs than white people because of discrimination, and as evidence of this, they will point to studies showing that black applications get fewer callbacks than white applications do, even when the applications are identical, other than the fact that one of them has a name that implies a black person and the other has a name that implies a white person. And they think this is really good evidence that racism is taking place, and in this video I'm going to try to explain why that is not good evidence at all. At its base, the most fundamental problem with this argument is that it assumes that if white and black people have the same resumes, then they will make equally good employees. And there's just no reason to think that that's true. Now, in general, black people and white people exhibit a 0.35 standard deviation gap when it comes to job performance. That gap is even larger if job performance is measured objectively instead of with subjective measures like a supervisor giving his rating of someone. For some reason, the same people that discriminate against black people supposedly in hiring are also biased in favor of them when it comes to employee evaluations. Now, this gap in job performance needs to go away when we control for resumes if these studies are going to be seriously taken as evidence for racism. The problem with that supposition, well, actually there are many problems with that supposition. So the first is that if you look at things that are on resumes, job experience, educational attainment, reference checks, these things only weakly correlate with job performance. And so because of that, there's no obvious reason to assume that the racial gap in job performance will shrink to zero if you control for these variables. And if it doesn't, and if even when looking at people with the same resumes, whites on average have a higher level of job performance, then there's a non-racist reason to prefer the white applicant over the black applicant. Now, our confidence that these experiments don't work will increase even more if we understand a little bit about distributions and thresholds. We can visualize the distribution of job performance among whites and among blacks as two overlapping normal distributions. Most of the things on a resume are qualifications that can be conceptualized as threshold qualifications, and what I mean by that is that they ensure a certain quality of performance, but they don't measure well variation beyond that base threshold. So for instance, if you're hiring an accountant, you require an accounting degree that ensures a certain basic competency in accounting, but some people with an accounting degree will be barely beyond that basic level of competency, and some people will be way beyond it, and a threshold requirement will not discern between that kind of high-level variation. We can visualize what's going on here if we place a line down and say that this is the line for the threshold, that in order to have the qualification we're talking about, you have to have a job performance level that is to the right of this threshold line. And if it was education, we could do a similar thing, or if we plotted instead of job performance, something like cognitive ability and determination, right? So what we see is that to the right of the threshold line, the black mean is still lesser than the white mean. This isn't because I chose a threshold line at a particular place. This is true anywhere on this graph. And because of that, we can generalize and say that equating for threshold qualifications cannot reduce a mean difference between two distributions to zero. It can lessen the gap, perhaps, but it cannot reduce it to zero if it exists in the general population before you apply any threshold qualification. And so, it is just statistically not going to work out that by looking at the things on resumes, we're going to get people who have the same level of job performance. This is even more problematic if we consider the fact that a lot of variables which predict job performance are not contained on resumes. For instance, the single best predictor of job performance is probably cognitive ability, and it is not contained on resumes, and there is a large racial gap in cognitive ability, and since it is not contained on resumes, and because resumes don't have anything that perfectly correlates with cognitive ability, we should expect that the racial gap in cognitive ability will not disappear if we control for qualifications on a resume. And since, as I say, cognitive ability correlates with job performance, we should therefore expect that if you control for resume qualifications, white people on average will have a higher level of cognitive ability still than black people, and because of that, they will exhibit a higher level of job performance. These series of experiments are even dumber in a world of affirmative action. In a world of affirmative action, we artificially lower the requirements the black people have to meet in order to get a qualification. The result of that can be seen here. Obviously, the mean level of job performance of people to the right of the black requirement line is lesser than is the mean level of job performance for people to the right of the white qualification line. And this will actually create a situation in which equally qualified people will exhibit a racial difference favoring whites in job performance, even if in the general population there is no racial gap in job performance. That is how ridiculous these experiments are. Liberals, who are the people who are conducting these experiments and pointing to them, have created a context in which these experiments would not be valid even if there was no racial gap in job performance to begin with. I say that, of course, because affirmative action is widespread in the United States. And it's worth noting how widespread and how extreme this crap is. So, for instance, if we look at elite American law schools, on average, black students score 2.3 standard deviations lower than white students on their LSAT type scores, and this means that they will on average only score better than 11% of white students. Perhaps more importantly, black students from elite schools score worse than whites do from mid-range private schools, meaning that employers would be rational if they're concerned about LSAT type cognitive and lawyer ability to prefer white students from lesser schools over black students from more elite schools. We see a similar thing with medical schools, where black people are regularly admitted with scores that would predict for white people only an 8% chance of being admitted. If we turn to undergraduate schools, we see that black people are just given the equivalent of hundreds of SAT points for free. Now, I collected about 20 studies looking at the probability of blacks, Hispanics, and Asians getting into various institutions, law schools, undergraduate schools, medical schools, military academies, this sort of stuff, after controlling for qualifications. And the median result of this is that black people are 21 times more likely than white people to be admitted into such institutions, again controlling for qualifications. Hispanics are 3 times as likely, and Asians are 6% less likely. Now, if we use the average instead of the median, because of some schools that practice extremely outrageous affirmative action, black people end up being 175 times more likely than white people to get into these institutions, Hispanics 15 times more likely, and Asian people 60% more likely. So in the first place, this shows that employers cannot look at these sort of things and assume that they mean the same thing for blacks and whites. A white person that went to a medical school or a law school or an undergraduate school or a military academy had to have higher pre-existing qualifications to get into those institutions than did black people. And so therefore there's a rationale for employing the white person instead of the black person, even if they have equal qualifications. Secondly, I think this should make us doubt the idea that the economy can be accurately described as exhibiting white privilege, even if these experiments are taken at face value. Because even if it's true that black people have to, roughly speaking, apply to 1/3 more jobs than white people do, they also have a 2,100% advantage when it comes to getting into a good college. And some people might prefer that advantage over the white advantage, and maybe the black privilege is more advantageous than white privilege if we're comparing these two figures. Now, moving away from education, in the 1960s and ever since, the federal government instituted policies such that the people that it employs and the people that are employed by state and local governments, including contract workers, for the most part, they are forced to fit into racial quotas. And as of 2017, there are about 14 million such employees in the United States, and this accounts for roughly 1/10 of the economy. In the remaining 90%, we have a situation of voluntary affirmative action or discrimination against white people. So if you look at data on the S&P 100, 90% of those companies engage in diversity initiatives, and roughly 75% of them set specific hiring targets for minorities in their workforce. This is not what a racist society looks like. This is not what a society looks like where the economy is run by people trying to discriminate against minorities. It's always a weird fantasy liberals have, that we live in a society where the people that run the economy are racist, but they all also pretend to not be racist, even though they're the people running the society. In actually racist societies, they just openly say that they're discriminating against people, kind of like how these companies are openly saying that they are trying to reduce the number of white males they hire, right? That's what happens in an actually racist society. The institutions just proclaim their racism because they're actually racist, and it's okay to be racist in their society, kind of by definition, because it's a racist society. So this whole line of reasoning with these discrimination experiments becomes even more stupid if we look at direct measures of job performance among people who have the same job but differ in their race. So meta-analyses show that there's a roughly 0.3 standard deviation gap between whites and blacks in job performance when you're looking at people who have the same job in the same business. And this implies lots of things. So for one thing, this implies that job experience is not an equivalent thing between whites and blacks, because on average, a white person will have done their past jobs better than the black people will have. That's just a fact. Secondly, if employers are discriminating against black people in terms of their on-paper qualifications, this implies that even when black people have marginally better qualifications than white people, as you might expect among people who have the same job in the same firm, if discrimination is taking place, well then even when they have better qualifications, their job performance is still worse. And that means that if we look at black and white people that have the same qualifications, we would expect an even larger job performance gap in favor of white people, which directly invalidates these studies, because this directly implies that there is a pretty large, probably, job performance gap in favor of white people among people with the same qualifications, and that gives us a non-racist reason to prefer white employees. This also implies that the affirmative action that companies say that they're instituting is really being instituted, because even though the requirements for black people in terms of the on-paper qualifications may be higher, the requirements for them in terms of job skill is evidently lesser than it is for white people. Now, this whole line of thinking is further backed up by research on cognitive ability and educational attainment. So, for instance, in the early 90s, the U.S. federal government carried out a massive study looking at people's work-related ability to do math, to write, and to efficiently use information taken from a document. And black people not only scored lower than white people who were at the same level of educational attainment as them, but they scored worse than white people that were at marginally lower levels of education. So, for instance, black people with graduate degrees scored worse than white people with bachelor degrees, and white people with associate's degrees scored higher than black people with bachelor degrees. We can see the same thing if we look at data from the AFQT, which is a cognitive ability test designed by the military, looking at reasoning ability, mathematical ability, reading ability, this sort of thing. And looking at the data from 1980, we see that black people with 3 to 4 years of college education scored lower than did white people with only 1 to 2 years of college education. And in the 1950s, we see that black people who had gone to college for 3 to 4 years scored lower than white people who had only gone to high school and never went to college. We see the same sort of stuff if we look at people who are going to the same school. And we see it even back before affirmative action was really a thing. So, for instance, here's data from 13 different colleges from the 1960s, and every single one of them, white people on average have higher SAT scores than black people do. And in some of them, this gap is huge, almost an entire standard deviation. You see the same thing if you look at data from the early 70s in terms of the gap between Hispanics and whites in the California university system. Now, if you look at these hiring discrimination experiments, what you see is that the evidence for racism that they're measuring is becoming stronger with time. Now, this is obviously a problem if you think that they're measuring racism, unless you really think that black people are more discriminated against now than they were in the 70s, and that white people who run the economy are more racist now than were the white people running the economy in the 70s. On the other hand, if you think that these experiments are partially measuring a rational response to affirmative action, then this makes complete sense, since affirmative action is more prevalent now, and a greater proportion of African Americans have benefited from affirmative action than they had in the 1970s. And just as a cherry on top of these crap studies, we see that they have publication bias. Now, this is discernible via something called a funnel plot analysis. Basically, as the statistical precision of a study increases, it's going to better measure the true effect of whatever it is measuring. A set of studies will converge on a point as the precision increases. As the precision decreases, they will become ever more widespread. Some of the findings will be above the true effect, some of them will be below it. They should be symmetrically distributed around the true effect. If it's not symmetrical, that's evidence of publication bias. Normally what this looks like is a bunch of studies missing on the left side, on the side of smaller effects than what we think is the true effect. And this is because small findings, negative findings, are just not being published in a given literature. We can see here what this normally looks like. We can see that there's a bit of asymmetry between these two sides. By contrast, this is what the funnel plot looks like for these idiot experiments on discrimination in hiring. These plots are a joke. This is just some of the most biased results I've ever seen in any research literature. This is completely ridiculous. This sort of data makes it very obvious that the people doing this research are just not publishing results showing smaller effects, showing negative effects. Black people, if you look at the meta-analytic result, are 36% less likely to get a callback. That's almost surely not real. The real result is lesser. It's hard to say exactly how much lesser, but these studies are not trustworthy to begin with, on top of all of the other reasons for which they're essentially worthless. So in summary, callback experiments are not valid. There's no reason to assume that blacks and whites with the same resumes will have the same ability to perform at a job. There are lots of reasons to assume that that's not true, given how thresholds and distributions work, given the fact that resumes don't measure everything you need to measure, given the effects of affirmative action. And besides, this is what the direct data suggests if you look at job performance among people in the same job, in the same firm, and this is what you would assume based on the relationship between cognitive ability and educational attainment by race. And this way of looking at the experiments explains why the supposed discrimination against black people has increased of time. The racism interpretation of it cannot make sense of that finding, I don't think. And then on top of all of this, this field is massively plagued with publication bias, and so you shouldn't trust it anyway. And so for all of these reasons, this sort of research is not good evidence that black people are being discriminated against in the American economy.